Good morning, everyone. My name is Rafal Wojtczuk. I work for the company named Bromium, and this talk is titled Layers on Layers Bypassing Endpoint Security. We'll talk about various endpoint security solutions and their common problems. More specifically, the agenda is we will start about explaining the difference between kernel mode and user mode execution. I hope you all know more or less about it, so just quick introduction. Then again, I will dwell a little bit on why kernel exploits are important and relevant, especially nowadays. And then we'll go through all these nice acronyms, AV, EMET, SMEP, Sandboxie, DeepSafe, HIPS, and we'll just try to figure out how these security solutions relate to problems with kernel exploits. Okay, so difference between kernel mode and user mode. So it's all rooted in the hardware. From hardware perspective, Intel-compatible CPUs have 4 privilege levels, named rings and numbered from 0 to 3. Most of the operating system use only 2 of them, ring 0 and ring 3. Ring 0 is the privileged one. Effectively, there is no restrictions on what ring 0 code can do to the rest of the system. And that's why the kernel part of the operating system that needs all the privileges, needs to talk to the hardware, must execute with ring 0 privileges. So that's when kernel lives, and ring 0 is a non-privileged mode of execution, right? And all the user application browsers, spreadsheets, whatever, live in ring 3. And again, because it's unprivileged, it can do only what ring 0 allows it to do or configures it to do. So for instance, particularly ring 3 code cannot access the memory used by ring 0 code directly. It's not allowed. And that's why ring 0 code is protected from malicious ring 3. And it also means that all the security controls, access controls, etc. Should live in ring 0, which is protected from malicious ring 3 code. So really quick introduction. Okay, so we say ring 0 is privileged, all-powerful, so no wonder that malicious code attackers would like to get ability to execute code in this mode, in this all-powerful mode. However, normally, kernel is not exposed directly to the malicious payloads from the attacker. Usually, attacker interacts directly with some application, like a browser or Office application. So stages of an attack, when we talk about kernel exploits, usually involve these 3 steps. First, attacker needs to achieve code execution in context of the user mode application. So, for instance, you craft some malformed HTML file, which is passed to a browser, and then you exploit the browser, you have ability to run arbitrary code. And then, once we have it, we can prepare and run special user mode code that interacts with the kernel and tries to exploit vulnerability in it, and as a result, get ability to run arbitrary kernel mode code. And then the purpose of the exercise is ability to run something useful in the kernel mode, to do something useful with this ability. And again, these 3 steps of attacks are pretty common nowadays, especially for skilled attackers. If you look at some high-profile events, for instance, like pawn to own, consequest, similar things, this pattern is in all the time. When trying to, for instance, get full bypass of the security imposed by the browser, sandbox, etc. And for instance, MWR guys are pretty effective at it, so you can talk to them about it. Okay, so let's assume we already managed to be able to run arbitrary code in the context of the kernel, so what should we do? And it depends on the goal. And the most typical scenario is that all we do, we just grant the calling user mode process the highest possible privilege in user mode, so the system token, and we just return to this user mode process. So that's how it goes. We start with some CMD shell that's not privileged. It runs as some low privileged user. We run an exploit code, and then suddenly, ta-dam, we run as anti-authority system. And again, this is the highest possible user mode privilege. This particular tool I wrote for the purpose of this presentation to exercise a couple of things. We'll see more of it later. So again, if you look, for instance, at public exploits related to the kernel vulnerabilities, 99% of the time you see this. All an attacker needs from a kernel payload is to grant highest possible privilege to the user mode. And it usually is enough, especially when there is no other security software running. The problem is that many people have become very fixed on this pattern of exploitation. That they think it's one-to-one relationship. But whenever you have a kernel vulnerability and kernel exploit, you have to do this elevation of user mode process. And that's totally not true. It's totally the other way around. Again, once we have ability to run arbitrary code in kernel mode, we can essentially do anything. Particularly, again, once we have ability to run code in kernel mode, all the security measures implemented in kernel or in the user mode can be bypassed. And one obvious reason why it is possible is that, as I mentioned before, kernel memory is protected from malicious user mode by page tables. But there is no way to protect kernel memory or kernel code from itself, right? So once an attacker has ability to run code in the kernel mode, it can do anything it wants with all the code running in the kernel. It can overwrite it with knobs, it can zero it out completely, or can force your favorite security solution to compute like 1 million digits of pi number. Simply, there is no barrier anymore. At least that's the theory, because in reality, you cannot just wipe out all the executable code running in the kernel, for instance, some kernel driver, because the system would probably crash. So in reality, it's non-trivial to actually disable completely a given security solution, say HIPS or whatever, because what you would have to do is to thoroughly reverse engineer its internals, learn how the code operates, which are the ways that you can disable it altogether, and it takes a little bit more time. And it's a really dull job because it's specific to a single security solutions. It might be even bound to a particular version of the software, so it's not much interesting. It's possible though, in principle. What's more interesting is that there are a couple of methods which are generic that should work against almost all security solutions. And even though they do not disable it completely or totally wipe it out from the system, they're good enough to break some protection methods. And these are the most interesting, and that's what I would like to talk about. So again, just remember this single sentence from the whole presentation, that once you are in the kernel mode, all security protections methods that are in kernel mode are gone. And for the majority of the presentation, we'll just talk about a few generic methods which may not be complete, but can be sufficiently effective. And again, such methods are well known in the literature. The oldest one I found was just clearing kernel callback tables. So essentially make the watcher blind. So how it works, for instance, again, let's think about typical HIPS scenario. The HIPS kernel driver would like to know whenever a new process is created, right? So it can hook it, inspect it, etc. So the common way to do it is to register a callback with the kernel using certain API. So just saying, dear kernel, please let me know whenever a new process is created. And because this API is well defined, the malware running in kernel mode can mess with the data structures used by the APIs. It can simply clear all registered kernel callbacks. And it's very easy. Malware actually does it. There are examples of it. And the effect is that, again, this security product no longer receives notifications from the kernel. So it still resides in the memory, but it gets no events from the kernel. So essentially, it gets blind. I think the Unreal rootkit was the first one to use it. Another generic technique is migration or code injection to arbitrary user mode processes. So again, we're not trying to totally wipe out a given security solution from the system. Instead, what we'll try to achieve is to get control over each and every process, user mode process. which is again good enough. It usually means you have all access to the system. We see examples. So once again, these are the examples of generic approaches, not guaranteed to work every time, but we'll see it works good enough. And generally, theoretically, you can really disable or wipe out any code that resides in the kernel once you have ability to execute code in the kernel. Okay, and why it is all relevant nowadays? There would be not big deal if the kernel was secure. Again, this talk is exclusively about Windows, so whenever I say kernel, I mean Windows kernel. So if there was no easy way to exploit Windows kernel and get code execution in context of it, that would be not a problem. Unfortunately, the reality is a bit different. Again, in 2013 only, there were 76 CVE identifiers allocated for Windows vulnerabilities only, Windows kernel. So yes, it is a big problem. And again, if you look at events like Pwn2Own, CancerQuest, or HP, ZDI, that's really what's happening now. Okay, so that was kind of introduction. And now let's just briefly look at many security solutions and see how they relate to or how they are supposed to protect against kernel mode vulnerabilities. So first, antiviruses. Again, what they're trying to do, what typical AV tries to do, is to, prevent this first stage of attack. So even not allow some malicious payload enter the vulnerable application, right? And nowadays, the term AV is not well defined. Again, for the purpose of the presentation, I mean AV is just scanning for signatures in user mode. That's typical what you expect from AV. They can do other things, but let's focus on that. So it means it's not very relevant to the subject, right? AV has no way to interact to prevent exploiting kernel vulnerabilities. And it would be relevant if AV was capable of actually preventing the malicious code running in user mode, right? If it worked. But AV does not work. It does not work for 0 days, almost by definition, because 0 days means no available signatures. And in fact, even if you try to exploit a well-known old vulnerability, it's usually trivial to just tweak exploit code just to not carry some offending pattern in it. For instance, if you try to use some well-known shellcode from Metasploit, you cannot include it in the clear because AV will catch it easily. So you just need to encode it in some stupid way. And malware authors are well known to test their malware against many AVs before they are released, and they do a pretty decent job with it. And again, I uploaded this tool that exploits a single vulnerability, and as you see, none of the supported antivirus see anything wrong with it. So generally, AV is not relevant and for the topic of kernel vulnerabilities, and frankly, it does not work. So another nice acronym, EMET. Again, it tries to disrupt this first stage of exploitation, but a little bit later. It does not prevent the entry of malformed data to the application, but it tries to prevent actual execution of arbitrary code. So it does not prevent triggering of the actual vulnerability in the user mode, but tries to prevent the attacker from running arbitrary code. And how it works, EMET is essentially a set of hooks in user mode libraries like kernel32DLL or NTDLL that tries to catch many behaviors exposed by common shellcode or rob chain. For instance, whenever it sees that something tries to to execute virtual protect function on the stack, so make a stack executable, then it panics, right? Because that behavior will not be exhibited by any normal software. The only case when it happens is when the rob chain is running. Again, not very much relevant to the topic of kernel vulnerabilities. EMET is not related to preventing kernel exploits. And again, it would be nice if it worked, but even Microsoft admits that it's just, it hires the bar. Makes exploitation more difficult, but it's all bypassable, and I won't dwell on it because it's not much relevant, but you can see the paper of my colleague Jared, which has recently broke all the protection in EMET 4.1. So again, not relevant and not really works. Okay, so now finally we get to something really related to kernel vulnerabilities, SMEP. Now it tries to break the latest stage of exploit, so running useful kernel mode payload. And SMEP is actually a feature in more or less new Intel CPUs. The trick is to forbid running the code that's stored in user mode memory if it runs with kernel privileges. That's the common way how kernel exploit works. You prepare your shellcode in the memory that you have access to, so in user mode memory, then corrupt the kernel state so the execution is diverted into your shellcode that you have prepared. And SMEP prevents exactly that. Well, in order for it to work at all, there is an assumption that attacker must prepare its shellcode in user mode, right? If it was possible for an attacker to prepare arbitrary memory contents in kernel mode, which is executable, then SMEP would be relevant because attacker would just try to execute code that is stored in kernel pages. And Windows 8 on 64 bits does pretty decent job about it. On 32 bits it's a little bit broken, but let's assume that it's fine. Okay, so that is pretty cool. It's a very sensible thing to do. It should be done from the very beginning. But again, the generic bypass is available. So just like around 2003, malware authors begin to bypass DEP or NX by using ROP in user mode, so you can generally bypass SMEP by doing return-oriented programming within the kernel. And the usually suggested way is that first you jump into the piece of the kernel code that will disable SMEP by clearing this particular bit, and then you're allowed to execute code in user mode memory as usual. So the vulnerability that I studied a little bit for the purpose of this presentation is 2013-3660. This vulnerability primitive allows you to override arbitrary location in the kernel, including the kernel, with an address of the kernel buffer. And let's see how the public proof of concept code from Tavis Ormandy, how it works. It overrides a kernel code pointer. So it overrides a location in the kernel memory that stores the pointer to the code, and it overrides again it with the address of the user mode shellcode, of the code stored in the user mode pages. And then because of this vulnerability, the state of the kernel is corrupted so that it jumps into this user mode payload. And if you run this exploit on Windows 8 on your CPU, you get this. You get a bug check. You can see in the bottom, attempted execute of non-execute memory. So this protection really works for this particular exploit, right? It works how designed. So that's nice. Again, there is no, attacker has other ways, right? If it gets a little bit more constructive, it can be bypassed. So I came with this a little bit interesting tweak how to exploit this vulnerability. So first, you do not overwrite the code pointer immediately, but first you overwrite a certain kernel variable named nt-mm user probe address, which stores the highest user mode address. So this vulnerability is consulted by the kernel whenever it wants to check, is a given address kernel mode or user mode? So if you corrupt it, it means that the result is you can write to any kernel location. Again, because you corrupted this threshold memory. And if you have it, because this approach is well known, it was like published in 2011, but the new thing, particularly for SMEP, is that you can use this ability to mess with page tables. You can set the user mode bit in the page table for some page X, which initially was user mode, but now you set this bit and now kernel thinks it's kernel mode. So the flow is you prepare your shellcode in your user memory, and then using this vulnerability, you mark your user memory as kernel, right? From this moment on, this page looks like a kernel mode. And then proceed as before, just by corrupting some code pointer and diverting execution to X. And it works, surprisingly. So in this tool, all you need to do is to enable this behavior of messing with page table by just adding a command line switch. And then it works exactly as before. Again, user mode cmd.exe is granted elevated privileges, and it really works on Windows 8. On vulnerable versions of Windows 8 to this vulnerability, right? Because it was patched like a year ago. Okay, so again, it's a common pattern that there is a protection method that blocks many common ways of exploitation, but if you just work a little bit harder, you can get around it. So a very short note about Sandboxie version 4 and Chrome Sandbox. So both are, Sandboxie is a generic sandbox when you can run any program sandboxed, and Chrome Sandbox is a sandbox designed only for the browser. Interestingly, in both these cases, the isolations of the sandbox process from the rest of the system is implemented using usual OS security mechanisms. So the sandbox runs, for instance, with a restricted token as low integrity level, etc., etc. All using normal Windows operating system mechanisms. And the problem is that if you are able to, well, steal the authentication token like we saw before, all these protections are gone immediately, right? Because again, things like restricted token and integrity level are derived from the current authentication token for a process. So in order to bypass these two solutions, you don't need to do anything fancy, almost, but in principle, yes. You just run this most common kernel mode payload, you get elevated user mode privileges, and the sandbox is totally gone. And this time it's total bypass. There is nothing left. One positive thing that can be said about Chrome Sandbox, it limits the number of usable exploits. That's interesting, because it runs in an environment in which some resources required for launch many kernel exploits are not available. For instance, you cannot run a debugger in such an environment. So that's good, but the problem is that all the exploits related to the graphics subsystem are still exploitable. And in fact, it's the fact that within the Windows kernel there is this giant blob implementing all the graphics subsystem. It is one of the reasons why there are so many vulnerabilities in Windows kernel. Again, such a large code base running in kernel means usually the larger code base, the more vulnerabilities you have, right? So that's one of the direct reasons. Again, so this is not interesting. So maybe let's get to something interesting for a change. Sandboxie version 3, so an older one, happens to be more interesting. I would say it was not designed with protecting kernel exploits in mind, but it happens to, well, offer some resistance. And this time, this latest, stage of the execution is targeted. So running useful kernel exploit. So how Sandboxie version 3 works is you can label some process as sandboxed. Let's set some flag in internal data structures. And now, whenever this process wants to request kernel to do anything, so it makes a system call, then the Sandboxie kernel driver places additional checks. So this time, we do not rely on the protection implemented by the Windows operating system. We place some extra additional checks. And that's different. That's definitely different. And what happens is, if you run the typical kernel exploit that just elevates user mode within Sandboxie, it seems to succeed, so you get NT authority system shell, but still it cannot do anything to the rest of the system. it's cool because it breaches the Windows built-in protection, the access control implemented by the Windows operating system, but still the sandbox driver is effective. Well, that's nice, definitely. Okay, and some similar capability can be expected from host intrusion prevention system. HIPS is again very fuzzy term. There are millions of flavors of HIPS, and again, I cannot claim I even know about all of them. But generally, what you can expect from HIPS is first user mode exploitation prevention. So some hooks in user mode that tries to disrupt shellcode or opchains. Again, not relevant to the subject of this talk. It might be quite interesting if it works, but again, not relevant for now. Many HIPs feature some extra logging of user actions, right? So whenever you access some resource, it's logged for some forensic purposes. Nice, but again, not much relevant. It can do system integrity checks, similarly to what PatchGuard does. It's nice. But again, for the purpose of this talk, the most interesting part is, again, limiting ability of user processes, again, by some extra code, not relying on mere security boundaries enforced by OS. So if you have a decent HIPS, then no matter what the privilege of the user mode process is, whether it runs as admin or system or whatever, you should not be able to stop HIPS user mode services, right? HIPS should defend itself. It should prevent loading non-whitelisted kernel drivers. So it should, again, disallow entering unknown kernel drivers into the system. Also, it should forbid messing with some protected systems. Like certain processes are valuable, like ASS holds the cached credential for every user. So a decent intrusion prevention system should not allow to inject code into LSASS to steal credentials from it. And again, it's a little bit similar to what Sandboxie version 3 does, in a way that it should implement its own set of security controls, access control. Again, something additional to the bare operating system does. Okay, and that leads us to this another generic bypass method, which is user mode code injection from the kernel. Again, it beats all these process restrictions, right? For instance, let's get back to the, yeah. So, okay, even if this process cannot do anything, even if you elevate it, if our kernel payload can inject arbitrary code here to non-sandbox process, then we effectively bypass all the sandbox. And similarly, at least to some extent, it's similar with HIPS. Generally, if there is some resource that's coveted by the attacker, like some file, some contents of memory, and if it is present in any process Y, right, in any process on the system, then we can grab this resource by injecting code into process Y, right? Well, if there is a resource that's not accessible by any process on the system, then it's not useful, I would say. Usually resources are for the purpose of being used by at least one process, right? So we can assume there should be at least one process capable of accessing this resource. So how can we inject code into the context of the user mode process from the kernel mode? Because in user mode, it's pretty simple. You have APIs for it. There is an API named create remote thread that you can just call, and ta-dam, you get code execution in another process. But again, in user mode, it's simple to stop, because in order to use create remote thread, first you need to call open process. And it's easy to hook open process to disallow opening protected processes. And there is no such protection in kernel mode. So the most widely discussed method is this kernel API, insert q APC, which effectively queues an asynchronous procedure call in the context of a given process. And it's nice, it works. The problem with it is that it's heavily dependent on kernel APIs. So you have to prepare the APC, then you have to queue it. Then there is a problem with alertable vs non-alertable threads. And the main problem is that because it must use some kernel API, if some security solution like HIPS or Sandbox monitors usage of this API, it can catch the exploit, right? It sees that, someone tries to queue APC for a protected process. It won't be allowed, right? And also this method allows you to inject code into a single process at a time only, which might be a problem. And much nicer and more elegant method is syscall sysenter MSR override. With this method, there is no kernel API use at all. All you need to do is to write to a CPU register. And again, there is no way to hook write to a CPU register. Almost, we'll get back to that. So how it works, you attack the method how system calls are dispatched from user mode. So whenever a process wants a service from the kernel, so it invokes a system call, then the CPU looks at a particular CPU register where in the kernel mode there is a syscall handler, and it jumps to this kernel mode code. And obviously, if we can just override this single CPU register, it means whenever process wants to do something, it will call the code of our choosing, right? It means we can control the behavior of all the syscalls, and it particularly means we can inject code. And again, it's quite elegant, it works very well, and the best thing is that you control all the processes at the same time, right? You control the behavior of all the processes. So that's pretty nice. And how to beat it? I think the only reliable way to beat it is by using virtualization. And McAfee DeepSafe does exactly that. So what McAfee, how DeepSafe works, it actually deprivileges all the operating system. So it turns all the operating system, including the kernel, into a virtual machine. And that's quite a change of paradigm here, because from this moment on, I said that ring 0 is all powerful, there are no limits, there are no boundaries, right? It's not true in this scenario. In this scenario, your operating system is controlled by the hypervisor, and there are limits. And particularly, DeepSafe is pretty good at detecting anomalous behavior affecting the state of the CPU, particularly writing to the model-specific registers. What's next? Yeah, and DeepSafe generally tries to detect the rootkit-like behavior. So it tries to monitor the memory of the operating system, right, and see some anomalous behaviors. So particularly, it can, besides changes to the registers, it can find out whenever the interrupt descriptor table is changed or system service descriptor table is changed. Again, these data structures are commonly used by the rootkit to get control of the operating system. And many, many other things. It's quite impressive, and it works quite well. Again, what's important to note here is it's a change of paradigm. Now, your operating system is not, well, in control of the machine. It runs under the control of the hypervisor, right? That's a difference. And that's why you can detect reliably things like overwriting model-specific registers. So that's nice. Particularly if you run any kernel mode code that messes with model-specific registers, you get big alert from DeepSafe saying that the rootkit behavior write to the MSR register. I have no idea why it says some DGBV is responsible for it, but never mind. Anyway, that is reliable. It works. It really works. Again, it works reliably because we have another layer of control, right? Okay, so how to beat it? One more thing, just reiterate on the fact that DeepSafe is very good at detecting anomalous changes to the state of the CPU. And I said previously that the commonly suggested method of bypassing SMEP is just to clear this particular bit in the CR4 register. And again, DeepSafe is in a position to reliably detect this behavior. I'm not sure if it does it. I know at least another security solution that, based on virtualization, that does exactly that, detects clearing of SMEP bit. Okay, so what's the problem? DeepSafe is incomplete in a way that it really does not have a good way of detecting the mere escalation to the kernel mode. It can detect some malicious behavior, right? But it cannot prevent the mere escalation to the kernel mode. There is no easy way. So it means that your exploits will work fine to the point when you reach kernel shellcode. You just need to be very careful to not use any methods that are covered by DeepSafe. And then you're fine. MSR override will not do for the purpose of user mode injection. So what works? The thing that actually works is direct write to the memory of the user mode process, which can be dubbed as backing physical frame override. So how it works? It is based by the fact that all the decent operating systems implement memory sharing. So when you have a read-only memory in any process, it can be shared with other processes. So for instance, NTDLL code is read-only. So the page tables are set up so that this location in memory map to the same physical frame in memory. So you have two different processes, but they all map to the same location in the memory. And again, it's possible only because the mapping is read-only. If this mapping was read-write, then it would not work, because a single process could corrupt the memory used by other process, so that would not work. But as long as it's read-only, that it actually works. Again, when we are in kernel mode, all the protection enforced by page tables are irrelevant because we can change it, right? So we can easily write to any memory frame that stores code of the user mode process. Okay, yeah, so once again, how to overwrite this physical memory? Just mess with page tables again. One extra bonus on Windows platform is that on Windows, page tables are mapped at a fixed address, so it's very easy to find them. So again, you don't need any kernel APIs, you don't need to actually walk the page tables, it's just fixed at a given virtual address. That's nice. Okay, so what this method gives us, again, it gives us ability to modify the contents of all the processes, or say libraries that are used by all the processes, again with a single write. That's pretty nice, again. So, yeah. So there are two questions, what to overwrite and where to place the hook code. And again, this idea of overwriting the process of the user mode, the memory of user mode process was discussed before, and guys suggested that shared user data structure is the best one. Again, because it's shared in all the processes, and also on 32 bits, it controls how the syscalls are dispatched. There is a pointer in it, means that says this is the actual function that dispatches the system call. That works. If you overwrite this pointer in this shared user data, you can divert the system call execution. The problem is where to divert it to. Again, initially, authors suggested that you can just make shared user data executable and store the hook code in shared user data as well. And again, it's very nice because this page is present in all the process at the same virtual address, right? So again, you just need a single write and you have total hook of all the system calls in all the process. But when I tried it, it actually does not work on Windows 7 or older or newer. Apparently, because each process has a separate page table entry for the shared data. So if you would need to change, in order to make it executable, you would need to alter page tables for each process. And that's bad, especially if you consider what happens when you create a new process. Then there is a race. you would need to alter the page table for this process very early. Otherwise, it would be killed. A better method is just to override the actual syscall invocation in NTDLL. So this particular sysenter instruction or syscall. And similarly, the good working way of placing the hook code is, again, in NTDLL library, at some unused end of the section location, because again, sections are aligned at the page boundaries, right? So usually at the end of the section, you have some slack space which you can use. And that works, as we will see in a moment. Actually, when I was on the plane to here, I came upon this really perverted idea of storing the hook code in the kernel pages. That would be really cool, but it's untested. I need to find out if it works. But if it works, it's even better. Okay, so what's the effect? Unfortunately, okay, so that's the final demonstration. You would need, unfortunately, the font is pretty small, but I cannot do anything about it. But so what you see here is you have semantic critical system protection agent running. You have deep safe or deep defender running as well. And on top of it all, you run Sandboxie. You run the cmd.exe under the control of Sandboxie. So again, it has its own additional layers of the code. Okay, so this is CSP running. And here, okay, it's battery went dead. Okay, so here you have properties of services exe process. So it's supposed to be protected, right? And you can see it has two TCP ports open, presumably for its RPC interface. That's normal. And what we will do, okay, so what we'll do, we'll just, again, run this tool, this time trying to migrate code into the context of this services exe process. And you'll see it works. So find Waldo, find the difference between two pictures, right? So this is another one. So the difference is it has completed, no alerts whatever from Deep Defender, Sandboxie, or semantics HIPS. And another thing that changes is you see additional TCP port open in services exe. Suddenly, services exe listens on port 4444, and why it is so? Because it got injecting with the default Metasploit bind shell. So again, using this approach, we can inject arbitrary code into arbitrary process, again, get full control over it. Again, none of the protections deployed had any comments about it. And it also highlights the problem that it doesn't help if you stack one security solution upon each other if they share the common weakness, right? The problem with all of them is that they share the common vulnerability. They are, well, prone to kernel exploits, right? So even if you just stack one upon each other, you can just bypass them all with a single exploit. And that's pretty bad. So obviously, are there any solutions that are resilient to kernel exploits? There is one. We saw that Deep Defender, at least architecturally, has some potential to defend against kernel exploits, right? Because it implements this additional layer of control implemented in virtualization. And generally, virtualization is the way to go, if implemented properly, better than DeepSafe. Because, again, it changes the paradigm, implements another layer of control which cannot be altered if you get code in the context of the kernel. Yeah, references, thank you. Okay, that's about it. Any questions? 1 minute.